Thank you everybody for coming out. What a wonderful reception, what a beautiful space. Thank you very much, Spike, for the use of your amazing studio, whatever it is, college art extravaganza. It's so brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much. And to Erin for organising this as well. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of Wales and what you can find here. So this is, I mean, it actually has got a different title, Magic Mushrooms and Mental Health, but it's kind of like the science of magic mushrooms a bit, but it's also like the cultural history as well. And it's going to be a bit of everything really. So, and it could, I don't even know where it's going to go, to be honest, but I'll try some stuff. I'll just introduce myself a little bit more. I also work at Imperial College in London, where they've been pioneering a lot of the psychedelic research centre there. I teach an online master, well, not an online master's, but also an online professional certificate in psychedelics, altered states, and transpersonal psychology, whatever that is, but I don't even know. I should say that actually I'm a psychologist by training. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Greenwich, as Spike pointed out, and being a psychologist, you know, classically, all psychologists were screwed up teenagers, and one is trying to understand why that was, and I was no different. And of course I went away and studied psychology, and here I am decades later and I'm still screwed up, but at least I know why, so it comes in handy for something. And one of the things we've been doing at Greenwich, where I teach a course on the psychology of exceptional human experience, which is actually the title of my book, of which there's only 2 copies in existence.
Which is available Amazon.
Oh, bad, yeah, all our kind of disreputable online booksellers. Yeah, so I teach about the psychology of all those stuff that you don't get on a normal psychology degree, you know, like psychedelic experiences, paranormal, mystical, spiritual experiences, and just kind of basically trying to shoehorn as much magic back in through the back door of the academy for those poor souls who'd strayed in there and are looking for something a bit alternative. And it seems to be going quite well. And of course, you know, psychedelic research is a great home for all that kind of stuff. And so we started hosting conferences back in 2011. Actually, the first one was at University of Canterbury, called Breaking Convention, about psychedelic research. And there was about 500 people came along, and they weren't all hippies, you know, some of them were also academics. And so we've been putting that on every couple of years at Greenwich since then, and it's been kind of growing in size and getting weirder and more fantastic. And it's not just about the science and psychiatry and psychology, it's also about the humanities and the arts and the culture and the music. And there's also like workshops and art and music and after parties and installations and everything. So we're doing it again next year, as Spike points out, not at Greenwich anymore. We're going to move to the University of Canterbury, where it would probably look something like this. Maybe not, I'm not sure. So I'm just going to go back to kind of some of the origins of the use of psychedelics. Obviously in the West, it's a relatively new kind of thing in the kind of academic circles. We've only really known about psychedelics for, you know, about 100 years, if you don't include nitrous oxide. And magic mushrooms for even less time, you know, since the 1950s. But as indigenous people the world over have been making use of different psychedelic plants and fungi, and also occasionally animals as well. And, you know, they're kind of considered to be like the religion in a way, and that is magical spiritual practice that we call shamanism. Even though the word itself, shamanism, comes from the Tungus people, it's been applied to everybody who practices this kind of magical spiritual practice. It's always animistic, and it is that the shamans are people who go into an altered state of consciousness at will in the name of their community to transcend time and space and bring back useful information for their community and to communicate with the spirits, as we call them, of nature. And we find them the world over, whether it be in Mexico with the use of peyote with the huicholes, or also Mexico, Mazatec, where the West first discovered the use of psilocybin with Maria Sabina here, or the use of Amanita muscaria, perhaps in most of the Arctic North, everywhere from, you know, Canada to Siberia and everything in between. In this case, her interest in these beautiful red and white spotted mushrooms has gone to her fashion sense as well. That's a bit of an occupational hazard. This is she's from the Chukchi, or maybe the use of kind of, might that be datura perhaps in India, or patchouli in Australia, or iboga in Africa, or Syrian rue in the Middle East and North Africa, or use of ayahuasca in a veritable cornucopia of other psychedelics in the Amazon. Most of my own interest and work has been with an indigenous group from northern Mexico called the Huarádica. That's what they call themselves. They're better known as the Huicholes. And I began working with them 10 years ago, largely because they have a kind of a deep kind of interconnected cosmology which is embedded in the land and around their use of peyote cactus, which contains mescaline, and is therefore psychedelic. And it seems that they're a really intact indigenous group which never kind of really got infiltrated by the Spanish when they arrived in Mexico, and they basically would go on a pilgrimage every year, about 1,000 kilometers round trip from their home place in the center here to the deserts of what they call Wirikuta, and go and collect their peyote cactus. This is peyote, not mushrooms, but then they were under kind of grave threat from kind of mining operations. The recent president at that time in Mexico had done that classical political thing of speaking out both sides of his mouth at the same time, and was kind of sworn into office as president of Mexico, wearing traditional Huicholi dress, but at the same time he was giving out kind of mining prospecting licenses to foreign mining companies to basically tear up the whole of this kind of virgin wilderness kind of cactus sanctuary. It's called Wirikuta, where it's like 70% of the world's cactus species grow and 30% of them are endemic, and they wanted to kind of surface mine the whole lot and just kind of extract everything with kind of underground aquifers and destroy the whole thing with cyanide and just extract all the precious metals. So this indigenous tribe, the Huicholes, who'd basically been in hiding for the last 500 years and managed to keep their traditions intact, suddenly kind of came out and said, well, we need some outside help. And so we got invited out there to make a documentary film. This isn't it. This is a much better one than ours, but I recommend you watch this one if you do want to watch one, called Huicholes, the Last of the Peyote Guardians. But we did go there and make a film, and so I've been working with these people for about 10 years, and they very much have this traditional hunter-gatherer, semi-subsistence agricultural lifestyle, focused around their use of peyote, which has been used in that region for thousands of years. And everybody from age kind of 2 to age kind of 102 go on these pilgrimages to go and collect the peyote. And I was introduced to some of their Marakamis, their shamans, and we invited them to come and do a ceremony at the University of Greenwich for our psychedelic research conference. I'm going to skip some of the story, but effectively we did this Murakami, this shaman by the name of Santos. He was actually the governor of the whole Huarádica nation of 30,000 people at this point, because they only appoint shamans as political leaders because they don't want them to be political. And but he basically been on a mission because he said the fire had told him that they had to stop kind of hiding out and they had to go out into the world. And he had to come to Europe and parts of the world. They all went out in different directions, and he came to the UK. And he'd been told that by the fire that he had to wake up the stories of the land, of this land. And somebody told him the oldest part of the land of the UK was Britain. Was Wales. So he wanted to come up here and wake up the stories. And so it turns out I was just moving to Wales at that point in time, up in Llanberis in Snowdonia, and it turns out a friend of mine, a guy I just met, actually lived in a place just down the valley called Kai Mavon. Has anyone heard of Kai Mavon? Yeah. So Eric, the storyteller, and so I went to see Eric, this storyteller, and said, "Oh, Eric, we've got this Huichol Murakami coming from Mexico," and he's like, "What, to Wales?" I was like, yeah, and he wants to come and wake up the stories of the land. And of course, Eric, being the storyteller, knew the stories of the land, and so he took us on a really interesting trip around. But I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but ultimately we ended up doing our own pilgrimage, much like they had, going around all these kind of sacred sites across the UK, well, not into Scotland, unfortunately, and even into Wales. And one of the places we came to was Presili, and we went to Cardigan and did some like all-night vigils up there, I'll call it. And as a number of sacred sites we went to over a 2-week period, doing kind of rituals and offerings, starting at Crossbones Cemetery in London and going across, you know, Avebury, Glastonbury, Stonehenge, Dartmoor, and just kind of basically on a kind of like shamanic SAS training. It's like a kind of spiritual ordeal, particularly on Dartmoor, and we basically just kind of non-stop moving around doing rituals and ceremonies at various ancient sacred sites, carrying our own teepee, which we erected in the middle of stone circles in the most remote places we could find, and doing all right ceremonies. There's Santos. I love this guy in the background, Freddie. He was a total skeptic about all of this at the start of the night. This is him in the morning. So yeah, some powerful stuff. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we picked up storytellers and local bards and people knowledgeable about the sacred sites along the way, everywhere we got to, and they would tell us about the local stories and myths and legends and cosmology of those places, including here at Presili. Of course, we went to Cardigan because that's where the blue stones supposedly come from, or thereabouts anyway. And I haven't got any pictures of Presili for some reason. Every time we've been up to Presili a few times, we've been doing this pilgrimage most years, and every time we go to Presili, it's insane. I don't know what happens there, but it's like, it's so intense. It's like and the shamans are always a bit like dubious about going there because it's like, oh no, not Presili. It's like, and it's like, oh, you know, the dragons are you know, they want something, and yeah. But I could tell you all kinds of stories, but I'm not. But we ended up at this place. This is in Wales, in North Wales, in a place called Druid Circle in Penman in the middle of a storm. It kind of turned our teepee into a banana during the night. So anyway, that's enough of those stories. But we were effectively learning from them about their ancient traditions, which they have with peyote, but it doesn't really belong in this land. You know, the peyote comes from the desert. They all their work, they work elementally with all the different elements, but they work primarily with fire, you know, and the desert and this cactus, you know. If anything, like the work on this land is a bit more aquatic than that. It's about mud and water, and it's very squelchy, and it's about the fungus, you know, that we have growing here, which are natural indigenous kind of power plants. What we don't have, effectively, or at least we've lost a grasp of, is the kind of cosmology and the mythology and the stories around the use of these indigenous sacred substances that we have. And so, you know, we were trying to learn some of the ritual structure from these guys, but also like trying to rediscover or recreate our own kind of cosmologies and mythologies around the use of magic mushrooms. And then it seems like a lot of the Welsh mythology kind of probably can tie into that, you know, the tales of Taliesin and the Mabinogion and stuff like that. Anyway, that's just a little side shoot of what I did on my holidays. I'll do some science now, or at least some archaeology and history. So, you know, the distribution of psychedelics and traditionally ethnobotanically is kind of wide across the world. We see the use of it everywhere in traditional indigenous cultures, and some of the archaeology suggests that the use of these substances goes back a very long time. There we go. Indirect evidence for the use of psilocybin mushrooms, for instance, goes back maybe 9,000 years in Tassili in Mali, based on these images they found in caves there in Tassili of like what has been interpreted as a kind of bee shaman who seems to be kind of festooned in mushrooms. This is in the desert now, weirdly enough, but it was at one point a rich tropical jungle, 9,000 years ago. But this is kind of indirect evidence. There's no direct evidence, unfortunately, because, you know, finding direct archaeological evidence for the use of mushrooms is very difficult because it's organic. They leave no trace behind. They just kind of disappear, and you don't need paraphernalia, which you might do with other psychoactive substances and plants to ingest them. You just gobble them down. So it's very hard to find direct first-hand evidence of archaeologically of mushroom use. Nevertheless, there are some theories that, like in the entire world of rock art, which is the earliest human art going back 100 to maybe 200,000 years, there was a theory put forward in the 1980s by these two archaeologists, Lewis, Williams and Dowson, that said that all Upper Paleolithic rock art includes these geometric patterns in them, and that's what kind of ties them all together, and that is indicative of the fact of people going into altered states, perhaps through mushrooms or dark cave spaces or chanting or drumming, probably mushrooms, we like to think, and then for making the first human artwork. And that's kind of backed up because there are certain geometric patterns that emerge very often in psychedelic experiences, such as with mushrooms, and they were first identified in the 1920s, and Lewis, Williams and Dowson found pretty good support for this from indigenous artwork from around the world and Upper Paleolithic artwork as well. Perhaps going even further back, there is I love little Erin is joining in. There is, a theory put forward. Has anyone heard of Terence McKenna? Yeah. Oh yes, yeah. 30 years ago now, he put forward this kind of radical idea that actually, our first human ancestors, somewhere, when was it? I don't know, somewhere in the last million years, but, by about 200,000 years, we had all these signs of culture and art and, all the rest of it. And that there was basically a huge kind of cognitive leap in humans as hominids relative to our kind of other primate cousins, which kind of led to the development of language and tool use and everything else, that we know about culture, art, science, technology, but in a really short evolutionary space of time. And what induced that massive cognitive leap, nobody really knows, but Terence McKenna speculated in what's now called the stoned ape hypothesis, that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were looking for foodstuffs, picked up mushrooms, gobbled them down, and hey presto, that happened. And that things like language came about through the induction of synesthesia. That is where you have a blending of the senses, so you can see sounds and taste shapes and so on. And so you can imagine like being able to see sounds, which is a very common experience, it turns out, with psychedelics like psilocybin, can give rise to the development of language, because you can form proper nouns around things based on how the sounds look. So you imagine our proto-human thrug, is trying to find some mushrooms, eats them accidentally, and suddenly he's going to go ugh, 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 and ugh comes out and it looks like a rock. And from that point on, rocks are called ugh, right? So you can see the possible development of proper nouns. It's a bit of a far-fetched theory, I have to say, but there is actually some theories of language evolution that are based on the idea of language having these synesthetic origins. So it's not too far-fetched. I did some of the only research actually that's been done with a colleague at Oxford, and we actually tried to do some experimental work and survey research mapping how common are psychedelic experiences, whether we could induce them in the lab and so on. And it turns out the classic tryptamine-ergic psychedelics like psilocybin very reliably produce experiences of synesthesia. So something like, between 45 and 55% of classic tryptamine psychedelic using people, humans, have experiences of synesthesia. So about half of them. LSD being the most common, but also ayahuasca and psilocybin. So it's possible, that there is this kind of psychedelic synesthetic origins to language. But the other part of the theory is that it should have been kind of evolutionarily selected for, and you can see how it might confer some advantages, but how it kind of becomes genetically embedded is not so clear. But Terence McKenna also suggested that it made people who ate the mushrooms hypersexual, right? And therefore they were more likely to breed and so on and so forth. And then those genetic traits for mushroom eating and synesthesia are carried through. We don't really know if mushrooms make you hypersexual, but I'll be interested to hear any stories. But I might come back to that. Fast forward to the kind of historic era, beyond prehistory. There was an ancient mystery cult in ancient Greece. Well, it was obviously ancient, it was in ancient Greece, but which lasted for about 2,000 years, called the Eleusinian Mysteries. There were mysteries because nobody actually really knew what happened. And it was actually where we get the word mystery from. And all the major statespeople and philosophers of that time were all initiated into these Eleusinian mysteries, including like Plato, Socrates, Cicero, and so on. We don't really know what happened, but what happened was they went to this place, they were given some kind of performance show, they drank some beverage, possibly made from grain, and then they come away believing in their own immortality, basically, that, you know, death wasn't the end, and that was the initiation. And various scholars suggested that they drank this beverage which from grain, because they worshipped Demeter, this grain goddess, it could have had ergot in there. And ergot is a type of fungus which has psychoactive properties. And this idea was only really put forward once this man here, Albert Hofmann, he was experimenting as a chemist working in Switzerland, trying to develop new medicines from ergot, which is actually a fungus. It kind of mimics the little ears of grain and grows and replaces them, and this is it kind of sprouting its fungus, its mushrooms. And he was working on that, and he was trying to develop medicines when something really astonishing happened. This is in 1943, which is also the same time in which they were developing a very different type of mushroom, a mushroom cloud, because this was when nuclear fission was achieved by the Manhattan Project. And within a month of that, Albert Hofmann had accidentally created LSD from ergot. So instead of blowing people up, nature's response perhaps to that was to blow people's minds. And of course, it blew his own mind as he cycled off into the history books, having had accidentally ingested a large quantity of LSD and became the first ever person to take LSD. So LSD is derived from a fungus, effectively. It's kind of like a synthetic, well, it's a tweak of the ergot alkaloids, basically. So that was in 1943. A few years later, this man here, Gordon Wasson, the English poet and playwright and author, had been rummaging through some old anthropological archives and found a story that there was reports of mushroom use in Mexico, in some of the kind of further outbacks of Oaxaca. And he tipped off his friend, Gordon Wasson, and his wife Valentina, who were amateur mycologists. Actually, Wasson was the vice president of JP Morgan Bank. So he was like this really influential, powerful man, but was really interested in the idea that mushrooms were at the origins of religion. And so on this tip-off from Robert Graves, he shot off to Mexico, went to Oaxaca, encountered this man, Don Aurelio, who took some mushrooms in a ceremony for Wasson. Wasson wasn't allowed any mushrooms at this point. And then Don Aurelio told the Wassons two things about their son back home in New York that neither of them knew about, but both of which turned out to be true, which kind of begs the question of how a indigenous peasant, 5 days donkey ride up a mountain in the backwaters of Mexico, knew what was going on with their son back in Mexico, in the United States, under the influence of these mushrooms. So then the Wassons took some of these samples of these mushrooms, and they attempted to kind of isolate the active chemicals from them by sending them off to these pharmaceutical companies, none of which were able to identify the active alkaloids because they were testing them on lab animals. And as you're probably aware, lab animals don't say very much when they're tripping, so they couldn't really identify what the active principles were. Some ended up in the laboratory of this man who 10 years earlier discovered LSD. And yeah, so he well, actually on his first LSD trip, he'd had a bit of a freaky time. He basically had an out-of-body experience, saw his kind of body down below him, was kind of up on the ceiling and thought he had died, and had a kind of like a near-death experience. And So what he did when he got hold of the fungus was he did a simple chromatography paper separation of the different alkaloids, and he tore it into strips, and he fed it to his lab assistants and himself, right? Hoping to identify the active psychoactive principles. But as a bit of a precaution, because of the bad trip he'd had on LSD the first time when he took it, he had a medical doctor with him. And it didn't really help, however, because in the kind of deep throes of his psychedelic experience, because he actually got psilocybin, he envisaged the medical doctor who was coming over with his stethoscope. He saw him as an Aztec priest, resplendent with feathered headdress, and instead of a stethoscope, he had a kind of obsidian knife in his hand, and it was coming to cut out his beating heart. So I think he probably rather wished he didn't have a doctor on hand. But curiously, like Albert Hofmann identified that there was something really curious about the nature of these mushroom experiences. And when he gave them to people elsewhere in Basel in Switzerland, where his lab was, they would often report seeing visions of like Aztec temples, Mayan temples, Aztec and Mayan artwork. And he couldn't quite understand how, other than they were somehow tapping into the consciousness of the original users of those substances. Anyway, so Albert later got beatified in the psychedelic community. But some of his synthetic mushrooms find its way out to Mexico with the Wassons, who'd moved on from Don Aurelio and started working with this Maztec shamaness by the name of Maria Sabina, who actually gave the Wassons some mushrooms to take and eat themselves. And that was the first recorded account of a Westerner taking part in one of these mushroom ceremonies in about 1953. And they took these photos of the ceremony, but they actually, she said, look, you can take pictures if you don't publish them anywhere, and they did, which was pretty bad. They put them on the kind of cover of Time magazine, not on the cover, but on the inside of Time magazine, and she became infamous overnight, and, you know, thousands of hippies and all the rest of it kind of piled down to Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca and basically ruined her life. She got her house burnt down twice, and her son was murdered. So it was rather pretty tragic what happened to her, and it kind of a bit reflective of a lot of kind of how Indigenous people are kind of end up on the butt of these stories. But it's worth, bearing that in mind. Anyway, so like fast forward again, like where are we now? 1960s to the psychedelic heyday, and people like Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor in psychology before turning blue and declaring himself a psychedelic high priest, and then, you know, kind of turning everyone to tune in, turn on and drop out. Made him quite notorious, but got him in a lot of trouble. Nixon shortly afterwards declared the war on drugs and made Timothy Leary public enemy number one. He got busted for cannabis use, ended up in prison, got busted out by the Black Panthers, went on the run, ended up in Afghanistan eventually when he got caught by the FBI, dragged back to the States, thrown back in prison. But before all of that, he was at Harvard as a professor of psychology and actually did some good scientific research. And that is, he established this idea of set and setting as well as the substance. So it's like, when you think about the psychoactive properties of a substance or a drug or a fungus, you know, normally in pharmacology you only really think about the substance, its potency, its like its dosage, its strength, its like molecular structure, and that's all kind of interested in terms of determining the experience you have. Except for with psychedelics, it isn't even half of the story, because it all really depends on what's going on in your mind at the time and the environment you're in, like set and setting, the psychological framework you bring to it, the set, and the environment in which you do it. And I've heard, you know, the Pasili Hills is a good setting by all accounts. So Leary did bring some good science to the table before going a little bit off the rails. And then, of course, you know, the 60s happened, and we were all there, weren't we? So a bit of the science then, that's a bit of the history. And, you know, psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, I mean, most people, when they think of magic mushrooms, think about psilocybin. That's the active principle of magic mushrooms. which mostly comes from the psilocybe genus, like psilocybe semiciliata. I still can't pronounce that after all these years, i.e. liberty caps, and there's about 100 species of psilocybin producing psilocybe genus mushrooms, but there's about another 100 species producing psilocybin in other genus of mushrooms as well, genii of mushrooms. But psilocybin belongs to this kind of tryptamine family of psychedelics. That is that the active chemical psilocybin is structurally similar to serotonin, which is a type of tryptamine. Serotonin is a really abundant neurochemical in your brain, which is important in everyday things like thinking and decision making and stuff like that. And so these psychedelic chemicals all mimic the action of serotonin in the brain, or at least they activate the serotonergic receptors in the brain. And that's what we think makes them in this particular classical class. And that includes things like LSD as well, but also DMT, which I might talk about later, but is basically the non-fungal kingdom's version of psilocybin. So you find DMT everywhere in nature except for in fungus. And you don't find psilocybin anywhere outside of fungus. So, and they are very parallel chemicals. They're very similar. But psilocybin wins because it's already active and DMT isn't. And then the other class of chemicals includes phenethylamines, dopaminergic, classically dopamine structure-like chemicals like mescaline and MDMA. But the chemistry is quite complex because there's loads of anomalies which don't fit into those, like diterpenoids, cholinergics, and anticholinergics. Interestingly, cholinergics include like fly agaric mushroom, which is a totally different chemical structure to psilocybin and works on a very different receptor system in the brain. So the red and white spotted amanitas are also magic mushrooms, but they are a different type of magic mushroom in many respects. And then also things like ketamine and MDA antagonists. Interestingly, and I'm going to spoil it for you now, ketamine is also produced by fungus. We recently discovered ketamine is like this kind of weird synthetic, ordinarily used to be thought of as being very synthetic. It was only ever man-made, as we know, until very recently. And it's this dissociative anesthetic, which is not structurally similar to anything we find naturally occurring in nature. But I came across a paper earlier this year in a brilliant journal, which you should all read, called Parasites and Vectors. I'm sure you're all subscribers. It's all about research on parasites. And it turns out there's a species of fungus which produces ketamine to hunt nematode worms. So we can consider that, though, yeah, it basically makes these kind of mycelial traps which captures the worm as it goes by, and then it injects it with ketamine and devours it. So we're now renaming the K-hole the wormhole. So yeah, you could think of ketamine fungus as being another type of magic mushroom, though I don't know anyone has tried them yet, apart from the worms. So just like some of the neuroscience, there's obviously been a lot of kind of news reports going back now 10 years about the positive benefits of psychedelics since Imperial College started doing, neuroimaging and clinical research, initially with psilocybin primarily. So this is from 2012, this is 10 years ago. And I was lucky enough to be one of the participants in those early studies, and they stuck me in a kind of MEG scanner, and this is more holiday snaps, and injected me with psilocybin, sorry. And this is in a magnetoencephalography. It looks a bit like one of those old perming devices you used to get at the hairdressers. But this, in this case, gives you a bit of a cosmic perm. And that's called MEG, magnetoencephalography, not to be confused with Magneto himself from X-Men, of course, who detests having this kind of brain imaging done on himself, hence the metal helmet. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. That's just me in the brain scanner. Oh yeah, here's some brains. There we go, like neuroscience. We need some brains. And what was quite astonishing with this initial research is, if you'd asked like any of the neuroscientists, what happens in the human brain when you give someone a psychedelic, they would have all said, well, because it's this kind of intense, overwhelming sensory experience, there's going to be more activity in some important brain region, maybe all of them, who knows. And, neuroscience has developed a lot in the last few decades, but nobody had done any research with psychedelics because of their extreme legal status, being more kind of more kind of legislated against than weapons grade uranium almost, right? And so when they did this first brain imaging study, of which I was a participant, they were like astonished to find, well, what they actually found was this, and that is all the increases in activity in the brain can be seen in red, right? So you might be surprised that there aren't any increase in activity in the brain. So that was a big surprise. And the decrease in activity are found in blue. Of course, Robin, the lead researcher at Imperial, said, well, seeing a decrease was surprising. We thought profound experience equaled more activity. So they didn't quite like that, and so they reanalyzed the data in a different way. And so these two circles represent kind of schematics of brains. That one's a placebo, this one is on psilocybin. You've probably seen this picture, it's been reproduced a lot. And the different colours around the outside represent different brain regions, and the different circles are different parts of those regions, and the lines in between represent the amount of communication going on between these different parts of the brain. So under placebo, you see there's very distinct and quite constrained communication channels which are operative, whereas under psilocybin, for instance, it looks like there's a bit of a party going on. And so effectively, every part of the brain is communicating pretty much with every other part of the brain in a way in which it doesn't ordinarily do. Now that, to me, initially seemed a little bit counterintuitive because on the one hand, you have no increase in activity and in fact a decrease in activity in this key region in the brain. It's actually, these are all in resonance with each of these blue regions. It's called the default mode network. And when that's active, it's indicative of, it's considered to be like your kind of ego, or identity, loosely speaking. So whenever you're mental time traveling, think about, what did I just do? Or what am I going to do in a minute? Or what am I going to say? Or what am I going to eat later tonight? Your default mode network is active. And so actually under the influence of psilocybin and other psychedelics, that activity is reduced. And yet at the same time, despite there being no increases in brain activity, there's a massive increase in the amount of connectivity between all these different brain regions, which aren't mutually inclusive, but they are a bit counterintuitive. So I'm going to do a demonstration. We're going to do a practical, if you're all right with that. I'm going to pass around a big bag of mushrooms. Spikers. And what we're going to do, if you're willing to, you want to do a bit of a practical? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to get you to be my brain, basically, my brain on drugs, in this case on psilocybin, because this is, that's partly made from my brain. And so what we're going to do is going to do my brain on placebo, first of all. So I need 4, 5 people just to stick their hand up. Any volunteers? Don't be shy. Go on, there's one at the back. Come on. Okay, you people, perfect, that's enough. Yep. So what I'm going to get you to do is just strike up a really noisy conversation with those other people, 4 people with their hands up, okay? As loud as you can, just go for it, anything. It's very jovial at least. So that you could, I'd have to turn that bit of the brain off. Okay, so thank you very much. That was a very good demonstration. I think you'll find. So that's my brain normally, right? Not on drugs. There's only some parts of the brain communicating with each other, but they're doing it there's a lot of activity. It's quite loud. So that's a good representation. It's if you don't normally get the other parts of the brain laughing at them, but we could just ignore that. It depends on the brain, yeah. So now we're going to do my brain on psilocybin. So we're going to have everybody involved, but so everyone should be communicating with someone somewhere else, right? Everybody should be communicating with somebody in the room. But it shouldn't be any louder than the previous one because there shouldn't be any more brain activity. So you're going to have to kind of whisper, maybe even slightly lip reading, maybe that, that really hippie eye gazing thing, just like. But everybody should communicate with somebody quietly. Go. Oh. Well, that seems to be much more congenial. I don't know. Did anybody have a particular preference for which brain they like the most? I don't know. It makes me feel better anyway. So that's your brain on drugs, effectively, or in this case, psilocybin. So, I don't know. How are we doing for time? Maybe I should skip some of that. And I was going to look about. Maybe I should just say a little bit about the mental health, well, the kind of like the risks of psilocybin. You know, there's been a lot of movement towards developing these things as medicines, and in that case, when you consider like what a medicine is, you know, you want to develop a new medicine, even though it's been around for thousands of years, you have to kind of do a risk-benefit analysis. And so when you consider the risks when psilocybin, for instance, is used clinically, or in fact many classic psychedelics, even LSD. You'd say, well, you know, the risk of psychosis and suicide is actually quite low. I mean, it used to be said in the 60s, if you've taken LSD 3 times, you are by definition clinically insane. But we don't now believe that to be true, at least not for me. And, you know, large-scale epidemiological studies have shown that if you look at tens of thousands of people and you ask them about their previous drug use and about their psychiatric history, normally with like other non-psychedelic so-called recreational drugs, there's a relationship. So the more drug use history they have, the worse psychiatric history they have as well. But it turns out with psilocybin in particular, people who had taken psilocybin previously had lower incidence of use of psychiatric medication and inpatient treatment. So if anything, you know, they're not at any greater risk of mental health conditions or psychosis. And if you know, psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD were inducing psychosis reliably above the kind of any background level, then we would see it in these big epidemiological studies. Of course, some people might have a psychotic reaction, but we kind of interpret that in that they may have already had a propensity to develop psychosis anyway. But we don't see this epidemic of madness from people taking psychedelics like psilocybin. The physiological risks are also very low. So psilocybin is considered to be very low in side effects, also very low in toxicity. For instance, it's not thought to have any practical overdose value. It's like there's no amount of magic mushrooms you can eat which will give you an overdose, we don't think. So, you know, precisely 0 people die every year from a psilocybin overdose. And yet in some of the clinical trials that have been done, for instance, using these substances to treat addictions to other drugs have been shown to be very, very successful. You know, LSD for alcohol addiction and iboga for heroin addiction. And there was a recent study where they looked at psilocybin for the treatment of tobacco addiction, which is very pernicious. And they gave them either 1 high dose of psilocybin, a little bit of therapy to hold the experience. And they followed them up for a whole year. And like 1 year later, 2/3 of the sample had quit smoking still. They hadn't smoked a single cigarette, which is one of the most successful tobacco cessation intervention programs ever, by a long way. And then you think about this in terms of like, its kind of medico-political, legal kind of implications is that, so psilocybin actually, you know, is a Class A drug, which means you could potentially, and this never really happens, but you potentially get a lifetime in prison for supply and to 7 years in prison for possession alone, which is kind of crazy because it kills 0 people every year and can get you off to tobacco addiction, right? Whereas tobacco kills, hundreds of thousands of people every year, is legally available to anyone over the age of 18, and it doesn't get you off your psilocybin addiction either, right? Which is quite weird. And in fact, it wouldn't, because coming to the next point, psilocybin and LSD, these classic psychedelics, are thought to be non-addictive, right? They're not classically addictive. And everyone goes, well, that, you know, how does that work out? I mean, a colleague of mine is an ayahuasca researcher and is based in Brazil, and he spent a lot of time with all these indigenous tribes doing research. And I put this psychology conference I organized, and he was talking about ayahuasca, and one of my colleagues puts his hands up and he goes, "But isn't this stuff addictive?" And my friend Eduardo turned around and said, "Well, no, and I would know. I've taken it thousands of times." True story. But in terms of the clinical research, and there is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is rare but a possibility, and that's when the drugs wear off, some people are still having perceptual distortions, what used to be called flashbacks, but we don't know how common this is, maybe certainly less than 0.1%, that's still potentially quite considerable number of people, but the way we're conceptualizing it now is that recent research, we've seen that it overlaps massively with this now known congenital condition called visual snow syndrome, which only got a name a few years ago, and that is about 1 or 2% of the population have like these kind of perceptual distortions in their visual field, which they have from birth, so it doesn't normally bother them, but they do see a kind of pixelated visual field when they look up at a blue sky or whatever, and floaters, and more likely to have tinnitus and migraines and things like that. And then what we find is that people who have this psychedelic-induced persisting perceptual disorder, it almost looks identical to visual snow syndrome. So it's probably those people who are just below the threshold, and visual snow gets triggered by their use of a psychedelic like psilocybin maybe. Mostly LSD induces it. And so potentially we could find it if it's genetically dependent and screen people out. Anyway, so the clinical research though, I mean, all of this was done in the 1960s anyway. They started using psychedelics, like mostly LSD back then, but also occasionally psilocybin to treat addictions, as I've already talked about, but also depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and end-of-life existential fear, and resulting comorbidity from that. And so there's been all these studies being conducted looking at the potential of psychedelics in the treatment of these things. Again, now 50 years later, after this massive hiatus since the war on drugs, and basically showing the same things that they found in the 1960s, but with better science, which will hopefully convince the regulators to then approve these things as medicines. I'll give you an example. This is an end-of-life study. So they're not trying to make people live any longer, but they're trying to help people deal with the fact these are all people that had stage 4 cancer, terminal cancer, and they had a lot of depression and anxiety going along with that. And so they gave them either a very small dose or a high dose of psilocybin. The low dose was like a control. The top 2 graphs are depression, the bottom 2 are anxiety, and they followed them up initially for 5 weeks. And the first graph on the left, the top left, this one here, shows reductions in symptoms of depression. And they found that there was a few people in the low dose, about 30% responded and had reductions. But those people that had a high dose, about 90% of them had reductions in their depressive symptoms for up to 5 weeks. And then they did a 6-month follow-up, which is this one here, and they found at 6 months, about 80% of them still had reductions in their depression from one high dose session. So it has very long-lasting effects from one dose. And then the next graph here is total remission of symptoms. So those people who are no longer evaluated as being clinically depressed, and they found about 60% at 5 weeks, and actually went up to about 2/3 after 6 months. So like after 6 months, 2/3 of those people who were depressed from end-of-life existential fear were no longer depressed. And a lot of that came about through people having like spiritual, profound, mystical type experiences, and often like changing how they thought about death, right? There's an amazing book called The Immortality Key, and it's based on this whole premise that actually early Christianity was based on these hallucinogenic funeral beer cults, and there was this kind of saying that if you die before you die, then you don't die when you do die. And which is if you have an experience of death, it changes the way you feel about death, and you no longer fear death. And that's kind of what's happening a lot with these people. So much so then, I was at Cheltenham Science Festival, and I accidentally said something about this, and next thing I know is splashed over all the right-wing papers that I'd suggested that we give geriatrics and care homes psilocybin, which I actually did. And the bottom two are anxiety. So we can see, the similar trend with anxiety because they're comorbid with depression. Yeah.
So were these experiments, or were these given under certain circumstances? You know, were they guided through the experience?
Yes, they did, because they kind of learned from those experiments they did in the 1950s, where if you give somebody LSD without any preparation and lock them in a room handcuffed to a bed, they have like a psychotic reaction. And they initially called them psychotomimetics because they thought they were a good model for psychosis. Turns out if you look after people and hold their hand a bit and give them some preparation, they tend to have very positive experiences. So they'll have a period of preparation, there'll be a lot of attention to the kind of environment, setting, they'll have a sitter, somebody sits there, literally usually holds their hand, and they have a period of integration afterwards. So yeah.
Is there any comparisons with microdosing?
Not really. In a way, I mean, so anyone know what microdosing is?
Yeah.
Kind of. Well, okay, most of you, that's good. So there's a kind of trend that started off in about the last 10 years. And the idea is you use psychedelics as kind of psychovitamins. You take them in very small doses, not every day, but every 2 or 3 days. So you got a day off to recover or whatever, if there was any effects. But technically speaking, it should be below the level at which you can actually feel any subjective effects, right? And that's called microdosing. And it's thought to have kind of beneficial effects on, focus and on your kind of anxiety or depression or like creativity at work or output or whatever it is, it does everything. Effectively microdosing apparently, but in self-report people do say that when you ask people, how's your microdosing, they all say it's amazing, I had the best day at work ever and all the rest of it. I was really productive and my anxiety levels were low. But when actually we do clinical trials, involved in the first clinical trials actually with LSD microdosing, and we didn't really find much in all the other studies since then. When they use a placebo control, like people's experiences aren't very different from the placebo unless they break the blind, and that is if they realise they've taken in the experimental drug, like they've taken a dose, they're more likely to think, oh, it's reducing their symptoms or increasing their creativity. So it seems like it's a potent placebo microdosing. It has a lot of expectancy. It might actually have some beneficial effects, but in controlled clinical studies, it's almost impossible to tell apart from just expectation. So I'm hence more of a macrodose researcher personally.
Do you think that's got something to do with the nature of the experience, that it's not the chemical reaction that your body's having to the drug, but it's the psychological processes you go through when you have a proper trip?
Well, I think partly, it definitely, I think in terms of big doses, you're having a profound psychological experience, and I think that's really important, not just the biology. But in in these microdosing studies, it's hard to know what's going on. It's like you can take this magical substance, which at high doses, gives people encounters with the divinity and changes their life. But you can take it and not actually have to put yourself through all of that, and it's going to be great, and it's going to have all the benefits. And it's kind of there's a lot of expectation gets built around that. It may well do something positive because it's been shown to induce neuroplasticity even at microdoses, so that that it can help develop new brain cells and brain connections and dendrites and all the rest of it. So it should, it potentially could have some genuine effect. It's just very hard to detect in clinical trials, and part of that might be that the clinical trials are quite short, maybe a few days or even a couple of weeks. People might microdose for several months often. But I think the real thing that's going on when people say, oh yeah, microdosing, getting all these benefits, is they're actually kind of mini dosing. They're not taking it below the subjective threshold. They're taking enough they can feel it and then going to work slightly tripping and having a great day. There's a bit of a difference between how microdosers define it and how scientists define it. And I think that's causing the difference. So, potentially. Shall I carry on, or should we just stop and have some questions?
Just have one more question about microdosing. Is
is there any traditional use that you found of such things that, or like small doses or microdosing?
So with indigenous people, I've mostly worked with the Radica, this Richolis, and they use peyote. I've been working with them for 10 years, and they do like their macro doses, but they're not averse to just taking a little bit as a medicine, because it also has medicinal properties, It's like antifungal, antibacterial. It's got all kinds of like medical beneficial properties, but they mostly treat it in a kind of magical, spiritual context, primarily. But I don't know. Maybe some communities do. But it's a bit of a Western conception, I think, I think. But yeah, we can carry on. What do you think, Spike? Should we?
Up to you. You got any bits you want to do before you wrap it up?
I was going to talk about...
We'll stop about 8.
I'll tell you a couple more things. So one of the things is like, what benefits then, mostly when people have these psychedelic experiences, is those people have what we call a mystical experience, if you know what that is. We don't really know what it is, but if the more spiritual and profound your experience, the more likely you are to have reductions in depression and anxiety. And that shows up reliably every time. So that in every study they've looked at, mostly with psilocybin, that scores, so scientists have found a way of measuring the mystical experience. Like, how mystical is your experience? Or it's 7.5. That's great. That's a full-blown mystical experience. Great. But when you do that and you correlate it with like reductions in alcohol craving or tobacco craving or reductions in depression, it's always related to how mystical your experience was. And in some cases very strongly. So the mystical experience and its intensity predicts better clinical outcomes, which to me says that the psychological component of the trip is important, maybe even more important than the biological things that are going on in the brain, right? Even though there are now kind of moves to try and make non-psychedelic psychedelics. They're trying to take psychedelic chemicals and tweak them to take all the trip out of them, but to have all the benefits. And I genuinely don't think they're going to work very well, personally, because of the importance of the mystical experience. What we've also found is that, and my own research, and I just want to throw this in because I think this is also important, is that even in the clinical trials when people take psychedelics, they have these mystical experiences, they have this kind of enhanced sense of connection. They feel more connected to themselves, to the natural environment, to other people, and to something kind of spiritual or divine as well. And so it's something like hippies have gone banging on about since the 60s, that you take psychedelics and you feel more connected to nature. There hadn't been any research on this until a few years ago when I did the first survey, and we asked people, so has taking psychedelics changed how much you interact with nature? Turns out that the vast majority of people said they interact more with nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. We wanted to know whether it enhanced people's sense of connection and concern as well. And we found that actually, this is something you never find in social science or psychological research, 100% of the respondents in our survey said, yeah, taking psychedelics made me feel more connected to nature. So everybody agreed. And there was 150 psychedelic users. And also, most of them also felt more concerned about the natural environment. And we wanted to see whether or not those attitudes also changed people's behaviors. And so we asked people about various ecological behaviors. So for instance, most of the people taking psychedelics said they changed their diet as a result of taking psychedelics. I don't know what to. We didn't ask them. Presumably vegetarian. Yeah, they're just eating magic mushrooms for breakfast every day. Definitely that, yeah. But also like a vegetarian, vegan, vegan, I don't know what. But the other statistic I like next to that is just over half of the people taking psychedelics said taking them had made them increase the amount of gardening they do, right? And presumably they weren't just all growing magic mushrooms, like, some vegetables as well. Even down to like 16% had changed their careers. They'd taken psychedelics and gone, quit their jobs and taken up, 2 people in our sample took up PhDs in botany, the study of plants as a result of their psychedelic experiences, which gives me some hope. And then we wanted to know, well, what psychedelic substance is the one that makes people most connected to nature and most concerned about it? And the answer was magic mushrooms. Of course it was, yeah. Everybody knows that. It turns out that ketamine, however, makes people really dissociated and detached and not connected or concerned about anything, really. And so we put forward this paper recently in Health Psychology Open. We're saying, that it's all well and good people taking psychedelics or psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in a lab or a clinic or a hospital. And even when they do, we still see that they become more connected to nature as a result, even taking psilocybin in a lab. But if you took it in nature, people are going to increase their connection to nature as a result. And that's beneficial because for the long-term well-being, the more connected you are to nature, the better it is for your well-being, because it means you're more likely to spend more time in nature. And the more time you spend in nature is better for your well-being. Every hour you spend outside in the wilderness, there's significant reductions in your anxiety, for instance, So it's kind of like a win-win, turbo boosting, positive feedback loop effect if we give people magic mushrooms in the forest or on the side of a hill or by a waterfall or a lake or whatever it is, rather than in a clinic. And that also means that people take more care of their environment as well. So we can see that psilocybin in particular, but also all psychedelics change people's attitudes and behaviors around nature, can enhance their well-being. It can also enhance the environment, which then makes it better for everybody else as well, and also for all the other species. I mean, we are actually living in the biggest wave of mass extinction in 16 million years, the sixth mass extinction, almost all man-made and faster than any of the previous extinctions by some estimates. There won't be any of the species in about 600 years, so we are really in a bit of a pickle, let's say. And I'm just going to finish off this. I ran off a clinical drug trial in a hospital in North London looking at creative problem solving with psychedelics. And we gave people LSD, top-level scientists from Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, and they had to work on their toughest, theoretical problem in their field, something that hadn't been solved and that they were interested in understanding. And I can't tell you too much about it other than one of the participants was a guy called Merlin Sheldrake, you may have heard of. He's wrote this really amazing book called Entangled Life, all about fungus, which I recommend everyone to read. And in it, the first chapter, he talks about taking part in our experiment. He'd been working on his PhD at Cambridge for 3 years. He'd come to the end of it, and it was on the nature of this relationship between this fungus and a plant. And the plant grows directly out of the fungus, and it doesn't photosynthesize, gets all its energy from the fungus, and it has no chlorophyll, it's just translucent. And it'd always been considered to be this parasitic relationship, and he didn't really know, so he spent 3 years of his PhD studying this, and still wasn't sure, came to our lab, took LSD, and we interviewed all our scientists to see if they'd had any breakthroughs. And he said, well, how's your experience? He says, well, I turned into the fungus, right? And we're pretty sure he didn't because we were watching him, right? But we went with this, and we were like, okay, great. It's like, did you have any insights, And so we're like, and how was that? And he said, slimy. That's a waste of good LSD, but never mind. But then he published his book, and it actually changed his whole perspective because he basically looked at his problem in a completely different way. Instead of looking at it as a human, he looked at it from the perspective of the fungus, and that changed everything for him, not just about his own PhD, but about biology and mycology and science in general. And this is effectively what indigenous people do when they take psychedelics. The whole of Amerindian cosmology is based on this principle from this anthropologist who's been named as perspectivism. It's like, if you want to understand something, you turn into that thing, right? If you want to really know something, if you want to know the medicinal properties of a plant or how to gain power from a jaguar, for hunting or whatever it is, you turn into that thing. And you do that usually through some kind of altered state like drinking ayahuasca or eating peyote or mushrooms, right? And so that underpins the whole of Amerindian way of knowledge, which is complete opposite to Western science, where we try and be as objective as possible and step back and desiccate and dice and measure and, our things and try not to be in any way related to the outcomes. And I think it actually can change how we do science, particularly when we're thinking about ecological problems. So we could have psychedelics for better ecological problem solving by making people have better breakthrough discoveries, but also ones which are not human-centric. You can see it from perspective of other creatures. And I think if we do, we might avoid this, which is like zombie fungus. You heard about zombie fungus? Oh yeah, orthocordyceps. There's ones that kind of take over ants. There's an even worse one though, and that is this one that take over cicadas. There's 11 and 17 year cycle cicadas. They hibernate for 11 years or 17 years and they come out, and some of them are infected with this type of fungus, orthocordyceps. And what it does, whilst they're in hibernation, it basically slowly rots off its whole bottom, including its genitals, and replaces it with fungus. And then when they kind of swarm after 11 years or whatever, it then injects the cicadas with amphetamines and psilocybin and makes it hypersexual, and it basically goes around dry humping all the other cicadas and infecting them with fungus. Yeah, right. And so it's like, what kind of relationship do we want to have with fungus producing, psilocybin producing fungus? And if we're not in a symbiotic relationship with fungus and the natural world, that could, we could all end up like that. But maybe the hypersexuality does maybe relate to Terence McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis anyway. That's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.